Hey there, Silver Tongue Devil here. In this video, we're going to be looking at what I'm doing to put those big scores on the board in the main game. First things first, I've come across plenty of people that are not at 100% completion and are attempting those big point scoring runs. The simple fact of the matter is,
they're not ready.
Those achievements represent a lot of time in the game. That time should convert to base game knowledge. Gaining those big points and being efficient with your scoring, I can show you. Without that core knowledge that you will gain from 100% completing all of the achievements, you are going in unprepared, and that's not how we do things. They say life begins at 40. Well, I say in-death begins at 100%. Don't even worry about your score until that point.
You need men in these buildings. There are people inside. Far back is 30.
Yeah, I don't think that was the shot he was going for, but a headshot is a headshot, and as you are no doubt aware by now, every single headshot you hit scores, and this is regardless of whether that shot results in a kill. The best practice here is that you should always be aiming for the head. It does more damage, staggers enemies for longer, and it's how you score. If you are hitting enemies with body shots or killing them with specials, you're giving points away. The more points you give away, the further you have to get that score. And as we all know, the further you get in this game, the more deadly it becomes. More on that later.
I got him.
Well, that settles it then, doesn't it? We're going to have to stop using Hawkeye in these examples. He is not having a good day.
Yeah, no shit!
When it comes to distance, more is always better. However, if this is not coupled with headshots, then all that distance will make no difference to your score. Ultimately, you always need to be playing at the range that you are comfortable with. Always strive to increase that range and construct extreme range headshots. This quite simply involves opening up the range on targets of opportunity. I'll show you a quick example of a good place to practice this in Purgatory, and then we'll move along just as swiftly because I find this fucking boring. Get to Anakin's fortress, lure enemies onto the edge of the platform, stand on this little spire, and let fly. These extreme range headshots cap out at about 1,250 points. Attempt this as often as your sanity allows.
Don't be afraid, little girl.
Now it should come as no surprise that orphans are worth a lot of points. Each orphan's base points is worth 25,000. They will also take multiple headshots due to their high health pools, and at higher cycles this is a way to make them even more lucrative. You will find 5 of them across the cycle. 1 will appear in each world and 1 will appear in each pit. The ones in the pit will benefit from a multiplier, more on that in the next section. For now, what you need to know is if you kill every orphan in a cycle, it's worth just over 200,000 points. That is a hefty chunk of points regardless of the cycle, and you should always make an attempt on an orphan. Unless it's that one at the bottom of the pit of agony, in which case that one can fuck right off. In all seriousness, do know when to quit. Good advice for all situations, especially orphans, is that if you see a situation is taking a turn for the worse, you do what we do. You run. Never try and fight a losing battle. I can tell you now there'll be no parades for you back in the sanctuary. By now you should be familiar with all of the orphan spawning positions in the various level compositions. And if you haven't realised it yet, they are always in the 3rd section of Purgatory, just before Anakin's fortress, the last section of Paradise Lost. However, they can be in either section of the Abyss. Prepare accordingly.
Into the pit with those bloodthirsty sons of war!
Pits are without a doubt the most lucrative place that you can score points. Everything you do down here is worth 2.5 times more points than outside. Now the stakes down here are high, but it is worth it if you are chasing score. Orphans are obviously one of the big catches down here. There are ways and means to make them easier. However, if you are at the stage of scoring points, you should be well aware of them. The other big catch down here is of course the incubi. Absolute points bags. And by constructing extreme range headshots on them, their aforementioned name still rings true. At much later cycles, when they have an absolute ton of hit points, they become one of the biggest and easiest ways to score huge. And at over 3,000 points per headshot at those extreme ranges, I hope you can see why.
Out of the frying pan into the fire.
You better watch yourself. I mean physically, watch yourself.
Put simply, the further you can get into the game, the more points you'll score. From about cycle 8 and onwards, some of those standard enemies will have ridiculous amounts of hit points. The more headshots they take, the more points you can make. You will also find that the amount of base gold an enemy is worth upon death increases. This, coupled with that little bit of gold you get from every headshot, all adds up in that tithe collector category. Doing everything that I'm showing you in this video efficiently and getting into the double digits of cycles, well, that should see you onto that illustrious front page of the IDU leaderboards. In this next section, we're going to be looking at why having the right special arrows
will be worth more to us than 10 legions of Sardaukar!
3 chimes, 3 arrows, their Winter's Bite, Hand of God, and Cataclysm. The reason why we carry those 3 is for the bosses, namely Anakim. Looking back to survivability for just a second, the gatekeeper to higher cycles is the big man himself. So if we have to take those arrows, we need to know how to use them effectively in normal play. Moreover, we also need to know how they can help us score. For points, Cataclysm is probably the most useless, but it does at least give us an option for assassinating orphans quick sharp. Now, I'd much rather you kill an orphan than you didn't. However, destroying them with cataclysms means you're missing on a rather large health pool enemy and all those juicy headshots. Winter's Bite represents a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it will freeze the enemy in place, allowing you to open up that distance and score all the headshots. On the other hand, all that tick damage that Winter's Bite has a tendency to do is HP that you could be using for more headshots. And finally, Hand of God is probably one of the best arrows for scoring. If you are not constructing those extreme range headshots, Hand of God is great for slowing everything around you. If you're using it, we can assume that you are at short range, and so you should have no problem making sure that every arrow finds a face.
Ah, yes! I was wondering what would break first. Your spirit? Or your body?
Last and by no means least, we are on to bosses. If you've made it this far in the video, I can assume that you are comfortable with every single one of the bosses in the game. You will need a level of familiarity with each of them, because to score extra points out of them, we are basically going to have to toy with them. We'll start with Gabriel. Although he can be a bit of a marathon, especially at those higher cycles, having good firing discipline and just shooting at his head when he is at distance will score you decent points. I can safely assume that you know to use the pillars to beat him, when you pop out to do damage when he's distant, stick him with the Hand of God, and then rain in the headshots. You don't need the Hand of God here, but it can definitely help take the pressure off whilst you're smashing him for points. As for Asmodeus, his Incubi can be worth decent points. Setting up that extreme range headshotting that we were talking about earlier can simply be done with headshots. Fall back away from them as far as possible and let fly. Each headshot you hit on them will stagger them and send them backwards. And as we know, the further away they are, the more points they're worth. From about cycle 12 and onwards, be careful. Concentrating on extreme headshots on an Incubi could result in a lava bath. If you're thinking it could be a bit touch and go on the current cycle against that first Incubi you come up against, start proceedings with a Winter's Bite to reduce the overall health pool by a chunk. As for the second Incubi in that last stage of Asmodeus, extreme range headshots are once again the order of the day. I'm sure you know how to control the waves at this stage of the game. Remember, all of the enemies that you can kill here are all worth points, and it's worth taking the time and effort, especially at those early cycles, to activate them and kill them. However, be aware that Asmodeus' final 4 Cupids that guard him are worth nothing and will respawn continuously. And finally, Anakim. I can safely assume that you are now a master at snow globing him. Using the techniques found in that video, you can kill every single archer. Once they are out of the way, you can continue to farm the enemies that will constantly respawn back into the level. Keep headshotting as distantly as possible until gold is no longer received from enemies. When you stop receiving gold is when you stop receiving points. Then simply finish up Anakim with headshots. Farming Anakim in this manner becomes increasingly more difficult the further you get into the cycles. When you choose to stop doing this is a decision I will leave to you.
Precious.